Welcome to Fenwick Street Station. Please select your destination and preferred fare type.
Renee Carter rode the 611 train for 9 years, and not one person who saw her every morning could have told you her name. She sat in the third seat of car 4, where the heater worked, in a gray wool coat she had bought for $3 at a church rummage sale. A satin head wrap the color of dried plums, a senior fare card worth $1.10 a ride. She could not see much anymore. The doctors had a long word for it, and she just called it the going. She did not know that the man whose signature was printed on the back of her fare card ran the whole transit system, or that the officer who put her off the platform that morning had just turned away the last person his mother ever spoke to. 72 hours later, that man stood in the basement of a church he never knew existed. He had come to make it right. He was not ready for the name, they said. That comes later. First the platform. First the cold. It was 6:04 in the morning, the third Tuesday in January, 34 degrees, and the fare machine on the Fenwick Street platform had just swallowed Renee Carter's card and not given it back. She did not panic. She had not panicked at anything in a long time. Renee was 64 years old, and for the last 6 of those years the world had been coming to her in light and shape and very little else. The doctors called it diabetic retinopathy. She called it the going. Her left eye had gone first. In the fall of the year Samuel died, and the right had followed slower, the way a porch light dims when the bulb is about to quit. She could see that the platform was lit. She could see the long gray smear of the train when it came. She could see the difference between a person and a pole if the person moved. The rest she did, by hand and by count and by the map, she kept in her head of a city she had walked for 41 years. Her morning began at 4:40, the way it had every weekday morning since the church gave her the keys to the kitchen. The alarm was an old wind-up clock because she could not read the numbers on a phone anymore, and she liked the sound of it, the small mechanical insistence of it in the dark. She lived on the second floor of a 3-family house on Quitman Street, in the back, where the rent was $640 and the radiator clanked like a man knocking to be let in. She had $1,140 a month between Samuel's pension and her own small check, and she did the month the way her grandmother had taught her to do it. On paper first, before the money came, so the money never got a vote. $640 for the rent, $41 for the gas, $53 for the lights in winter, less in summer. The insulin copay was $47 when the pharmacy had the coupon, and $112 when it didn't. And she had learned which Wednesday of the month the coupon reset, the second one, and she planned her sugar around it. That left, on a good month, $209 for food, and the bus, and everything a life needs that nobody writes down. And out of that $209, she still kept $11 in quarters in the inside pocket of the gray coat, because some things come before food, and a stranger's fare on a cold morning was one of them. After all of it, there was not a great deal left, but Renee had never in her life thought of herself as a poor woman. Her grandmother had come up from Bamberg County, South Carolina, in 1947 with a cardboard suitcase and a cast-iron skillet, and that woman had raised 6 children in 2 rooms, and never once let any of them walk into church looking like they didn't have a home. Renee had been raised to understand the difference between having little and being little. They were not the same thing. She dressed by feel. The coat she knew by the missing third button, which she had replaced with one slightly larger, so her thumb always found it first. The head wrap she tied without a mirror. She had not used a mirror in 4 years. She kept the kettle on the back left burner always, so she could find it in the dark, and she made her coffee the way Samuel Sue used to, too strong, with a little evaporated milk. She turned on the gospel station out of habit, low, and a choir she had heard 1,000 times filled the small kitchen while she ate one piece of toast standing at the counter. Because sitting down in the morning, her mother used to say, was how you talked yourself out of the day. At 5:32 she went down the back stairs, 14 of them, counting, her cane finding the lip of each one. The walk to Fenwick Street was 6/10 of a mile, 11 minutes at her pace, and she knew it by its cracks. There was a heaved square of sidewalk in front of the shuttered laundromat that she stepped over without thinking. There was the corner store with the bell on the door where Mr. Okafor said good morning to her every day, in a voice she could find in the dark. And most mornings she stopped, not to buy anything, just so the day would have a person in it before it had a train. This particular Tuesday she did not stop because she was carrying the box. On Mondays and Tuesdays Renee cooked breakfast in the basement of Mount Calvary Baptist on Springfield Avenue, and she had been doing it for 9 years, and almost no one knew how much of it came out of her own kitchen. The church paid for the eggs and the grits, the bacon, the biscuits she made from scratch, the collard greens she stewed down on Sunday nights for the men who came in off the cold and could not chew much else, the sweet potato pie she made on the first of every month. Because the first of the month is hard on people, and a hard week needs a sweet thing in it. Those she carried in herself, in a box on a folding cart. 6/10 of a mile, and then onto the train, and then 4 stops and another quarter mile on the far end. And she did not tell anybody what any of it cost her, because the moment you tell people what a thing cost you, her grandmother said, you have asked them to pay you back, and a gift you expect to be paid back for was never a gift. She fed somewhere between 32 and 51 people a morning, more on the cold weeks, and she had a system for the box on the cart that never varied, because a blind woman runs on system the way a train runs on track. 4 dozen biscuits in the bottom pan, wrapped in the dish towel that held the heat. The cornbread in the square pan above it, cut 9 by 9 into 81 pieces, so the corner pieces, the 4 best ones, came off first and went into the paper bag for the children. The greens in the deep pan, stewed 6 hours the Sunday before with a smoked turkey neck, because she had given up pork for her sugar, but had not given up on flavor. Because flavor, her grandmother said, is how you tell a person they are worth the trouble. On the first of the month, the pie. The cart had a bad left wheel that pulled, and she had learned the pull and corrected for it without thinking. 11 minutes to the platform, 4 stops on the 6:11, a quarter mile on the far end, the whole route a thing her body knew better than her mind did. She knew most of the people she fed by their voices and their footsteps. There was Ray, who had been to Vietnam and did not like to be touched on the shoulder, so she always spoke before she got near him. There was a woman named Pat who hummed when she ate and didn't know she did it. There were children. On the mornings, the school had a late start, and Renee saved the corner pieces of the cornbread for them because the corner pieces were the best, and children should learn early that somebody, somewhere, was saving the best for them. That was the part nobody saw. There was another part nobody saw either, and it happened on the platform. Over 9 years Renee had learned the sound of the fare machine when it would not take a card, the small flat beep of refusal, and she had learned the particular silence of a person standing in front of it, with no other card to try. Most was kids, 15, 16, with a card their mother had loaded that ran dry on a Thursday. Sometimes it was old men. Once a year or so it was a young mother with a stroller and a face that had already decided to be ashamed before anybody had said anything to her. Renee carried a roll of quarters in the inside pocket of the gray coat for exactly this, and when she heard that flat beep and then that silence, she would come up alongside, and she would say, so it stayed between them, "Here, baby, the machine likes mine," and she would tap her own card and pay the fare and turn away before the person could finish, saying thank you, because the thank you was not the point, and she did not want them to think it was. She had a way of doing it that left the other person their whole self. She never made it a lesson. She never said, be careful next time, or make sure your mother loads it Sunday. She just covered the $10 and moved off down the platform with her cart. And most of the time, The person never even got a good look at her face, which was the point. Because a gift the giver disappears from is the only kind that doesn't cost the receiver anything. She did not tell anyone. She had been doing it for 9 years. By her own rough count, which she did not keep on purpose, but which Samuel's old adding machine habit made happen in her head anyway, she figured it at 3 or 4 a week through the school year, fewer in summer. Call it 170 a year, give or take, which over 9 years came to somewhere north of 2,000 fares. For people she would never see again. Somewhere north of $2,200 out of a coffee can, though if you had said that number out loud to her, she'd have told you to hush. Because counting it was the same as charging for it. She did not think of it as charity. She thought of it as not walking past. There is a difference, and her grandmother had drilled the difference into her on the front porch of a house in Bamberg County that had since fallen down. You don't have to fix what's wrong with a person's whole life, the old woman used to say, snapping the ends off beans into her apron. You just have to not leave them standing there by themselves while it happens. That was the whole of Renee Carter's theology. And she had built a life on it, and it had cost her almost everything she had, and she would not have traded it. She had been married to Samuel for 31 years. He drove a delivery truck for a furniture company, and he had a laugh you could hear from the next room, and he died on a Wednesday in October of a heart that gave out at a red light, 58 years old, with the turn signal still ticking when they found him. They'd had one son, Andre, who was a good man and a careful one, and who lived in Atlanta now with a wife and a job in a hospital billing office, and who called every Sunday at 4, and who had asked her 3 times to come live with them, and 3 times she had said no. The last time he asked, this past Thanksgiving, he had gotten quiet on the phone and said, "Mama, you're up there in the cold by yourself, and I'm down here. And I can't sleep some nights for thinking about it." And Renee had heard the boy in the man's voice, the same boy who used to climb in the bed between her and Samuel during a thunderstorm, and it had nearly broken her. But she had said, "Baby, I am not by myself. I am up to my elbows in other people every blessed morning. There's a difference between alone and lonely, and your mama knows which one she is." She had not told him about the going of her eyes, not the full truth of it, because Andre would have been on a plane inside a week, and that was a kindness she could not afford to do to him. The kindness of letting him rescue her out of the only life she had left that was hers. So she stayed. She rode the 611, and on the morning the machine ate her card, she stood in front of it in the cold, with her cart and her box and her cane. And she did the only thing a person can do, which is the next reasonable thing. She reached into the inside pocket of the gray coat for her roll of quarters to pay her own fare the way she had paid 2,000 others, and she found that the pocket was empty, because the Friday before she had given the whole roll, $11 in quarters, to a boy at this same machine whose card had run dry, and she had not yet been to the bank to make another. She stood very still and counted what she had. $1.10, she thought, was in the change purse. $1.10 was exactly the fare. But the machine had her card and would not give it back, and the change purse, when her fingers found it and counted by feel, held $1 and 1 nickel and 3 pennies. And she did the arithmetic the way she did all her arithmetic now, in the dark behind her eyes. And the arithmetic said she was 2 pennies short of her own city. $1.10, and she had $1.08. This is the part of the story where you should understand something about the man at the other end of the line, because the morning was about to put the two of them in the same sentence, and a sentence is not fair if you only know one half of it. Damon Whitfield was 58 years old and the chairman of the Halstead Regional Transit Authority, which is to say he was the most powerful man most people in 3 counties had never heard of. He controlled 4 commuter lines, 19 bus routes, a budget of $410 million a year, and the fates of roughly 4,100 employees. And he could tell you the morning on-time performance of the Fenwick line to one decimal place, 91.4%, and the fact that it had slipped 0.6 of a point in the last quarter kept him up some nights more than the deficit did. He had built every inch of that power out of nothing at all. His mother had cleaned other people's houses. Cleotha Whitfield had raised Damon and his two sisters in a fourth-floor walk-up with a tub in the kitchen, and she had worked 6 days a week for white families in the suburbs who called her by her first name and never once asked her to sit down, and she had come home on the last bus every night, the 11:40, and Damon could still remember being a boy of 7 lying awake to hear the front door, because until he heard the front door the world was not safe. His mother had a saying too. Everybody's mother has a saying. Cleotha Whitfield's was, "Get yours, because nobody is coming to give it to you." And she said it the way you'd hand somebody a coat, like it was a thing to keep them warm. Damon got his. He went to Rutgers on a partial scholarship and a full-time job loading trucks on the overnight dock for $9.12 an hour. 6 years to a 4-year degree, because that is how long it takes when you are paying for it yourself. He came up through the city's public works department, and then the bus authority, and then the rail authority. And he learned, somewhere along the way, in a series of rooms where men in better suits than his had explained to him very patiently why people like him did not belong there, that the only thing the world respected was a system that did not bend. A man could be talked over. A man could be cut from a budget on a Friday afternoon by a vote he wasn't in the room for. But a system, a rule, a line on a ledger, those held. Those did not care whose son you were. So he became a man of systems. He was good at it the way some men are good with their hands. By 40, he ran procurement for the whole region. By 51, he was chairman. He married late and badly and divorced quietly, and he had no children. And he poured the thing other men pour into families into the Halstead system instead. He knew the on-time numbers of every line by heart. He knew the cost per rider down to the cent. And in the last 18 months, with the system bleeding from the slows and the board breathing down his neck about a deficit of $14 million, he had made a decision that he believed was simply the responsible one, the adult one. The one his mother would have understood. He had cracked down on fare evasion. The Halstead system was losing, by its own estimate, somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year, Rosridsters who boarded without paying. And Damon Whitfield looked at that number and did not see $2 million. He saw his mother counting out the bus fare from a coffee can on top of the refrigerator, never short, never once short. Because being short was not a thing Cleotha Whitfield permitted herself. And he saw every man who had ever explained to him why the rules were different for people like him, and somewhere in the place where a wound becomes a principle, he decided that the worst thing you could teach a system was that it would carry people who would not carry themselves. So he hired fare inspectors, 40 of them. He put them on the platforms in pairs, in the gray Halstead jacket, with handheld readers, and he wrote the policy himself. And there was a line in that policy, Section 4, Paragraph 2, that read, "A rider unable to produce valid fare media shall be directed to exit the platform. No exceptions for hardship." He had argued for that line in a board meeting against a younger member who'd called it cruel, and Damon Whitfield had said the sentence that the younger member would repeat to him, word for word. 72 hours from the morning the machine ate Renee Carter's card. He had said, "Mercy doesn't run trains." He believed it. He had a coffee can's worth of reasons to believe it. That was the thing about Damon Whitfield that the people who hated him never understood. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been taught one wrong thing so deeply and so young that it had grown into him, like a wire grows into a tree, and the tree does not know anymore where the wire ends and the wood begins. Officer Devin Mathis was 29 years old, and he had been a Halstead fare inspector for 5 months, and he badly needed to keep the job. He had a daughter who was 3 and an ex who was reasonable, and a rent that was not. And the Halstead inspector job paid $22.40 an hour with a benefits package, which in his world was a real thing, a thing worth being careful about. His supervisor had been clear in the Monday meeting. The citation numbers on the Fenwick line were soft. The chairman himself had flagged it, and soft numbers in your first 6 months were how you became a former Halstead employee. Devin Mathis had heard that and felt the cold of it in his stomach because he knew exactly what a former anything looked like. He had grown up watching his own father become a former. So when Devin Mathis stepped onto the Fenwick Street platform at 6:06 that morning and saw an old woman in a gray coat standing at the fare machine with no card in her hand and a cart full of foil pans, he did not see Renee Carter. He saw a citation. He saw a number on a sheet that would keep him employed. He was not a bad young man. He was a scared one. And a scared man with a rulebook is one of the most dangerous things in the world, because the rulebook lets him be cruel and call it duty. He walked up. He said, "Ma'am, I need to see your fare." Renee turned toward the voice. She could see that he was tall and that the jacket was the gray of authority. "The machine ate my card," she said, and her voice was steady and low, the voice she used at the machine with the kids. "I've got $1.08. The fare's $1.10 with my senior card. I'm 2 pennies short, baby. If you give me 1 second, I'll—" She had her hand in the change purse. She was going to ask him, or anybody, the way she had let 2,000 people ask her without ever making them ask. She did not get to finish the sentence. "I can't take a partial fare," Officer Mathis said. He had pulled out the handheld, was already keying something into it, and the keying made it easier, the way a clipboard makes anything easier. "Policy is no valid fare, you can't be on the platform. I need you to exit." He gestured at the cart, the box, the foil pans. "And you can't have all that on the platform anyway, that's a separate violation." There was a frozen moment then. There is always a frozen moment. Renee Carter stood perfectly still for what the security footage later would clock at 11 seconds. The train was coming. She could hear it, far down the line, the long iron breath of it. She had a basement full of men who would be cold and hungry in 40 minutes. She had $1.08 and a card inside a machine that would not give it back. And she had, standing in front of her, a frightened young man who had decided that the safest thing he could do that morning was to be hard to an old blind woman. And Renee understood all of it. All of it at once, the way you understand the weather, because she had spent her whole life on the receiving end of men who had been taught the wrong thing, young. She did not raise her voice. She did not say, "Do you know who I am?" because she was nobody and she knew it, and being nobody had never once made her ashamed. She did not cry. Her eyes had gone past crying years ago anyway. They did the wanting but not the doing. She said, "All right," and she bent down, 64 years old in the cold, and she began to gather the handle of the cart, to take her box and her foil pans and her $1.08 back up the ramp and out into the dark, 11 minutes home, and she would figure the rest out the way she figured everything out, which was alone, and 3 cars down the platform. A conductor named Walker, who had punched tickets on the Halstead line for 29 years, who was leaning out of the open door of car 4 the way he did every morning to watch his platform fill, saw an old woman in a gray coat bend down to a cart, and saw a gray jacket standing over her, and felt, before he understood anything at all, the small brass weight of the metal clipped to his lanyard go cold against his chest. Walker had carried that metal for 9 years. He did not, in that first second, know who the woman was. The platform was lit, but the light was bad, and his eyes were 56 years old, and she was 20 yards down. He knew only that someone old was being made small, and that he had a rule about that, a private rule, older than any rule in the Halstead policy book, and the rule was that on his platform, on his line, nobody got made small if Walker could help it. So he stepped down off the train, which a conductor is not supposed to do during boarding. And he started walking toward the gray jacket and the bent old woman, and the metal swung against his chest with each step. and he did not yet know that he was walking back into the worst night of his own life. To understand the medal, you have to go back 9 years, to a hospice on Lyons Avenue, and a Tuesday in early spring. 9 years before the morning of the Eaton Fair card, Walker's wife was dying. Her name was Loretta. They had been married 26 years, and she was the kind of woman who organized the food at every funeral on the block and never sat down at any of them, who kept a list in her head of who was sick and who was newly widowed, and who had a child who had gone quiet, and who showed up at all their doors with a foil pan and stayed exactly as long as she was needed, and not 1 minute longer. The cancer had moved through her in 9 months, the way a fire moves through a dry field, March to December, and at the end she was in a hospice bed on the 2nd floor of a building on Lyons Avenue, room 214. And Walker, who had never in his life been afraid of anything, who had broken up fights on the last train and pulled a man back from the floor of hands, was afraid now, all the way down to the floor of himself. Otherweight Suins, he could not be in the room. That was the shameful truth he had never told anyone. At the end, in those last days, he could not make himself sit in the room and watch Loretta breathe in that new and terrible way. And so he did what frightened men do. He found things to do in the hallway. He got the nurse's coffee. He went down to move the car that did not need moving, and he hated himself for it the whole time and could not stop. And on one of those evenings, the second to last evening, when Walker was standing in the hallway because he could not be in the room, a woman came out of the room 2 doors down, an old woman in a head wrap, and she did not seem to be able to see very well. She had a cane, and she stopped beside him in the hallway. She had been sitting, it turned out, with another patient, a man with no family, who liked someone to read the Psalms to him, and she came up to Lyons Avenue twice a week to do it, because, she said, when Walker finally asked her months later, a person should not have to die in a room with nobody in it. And there were always rooms with nobody in them. She did not tell Walker it was going to be all right. She did not give him advice. She had heard, through the thin walls, the new and terrible breathing 2 doors down, and she had heard a big man crying in a hallway trying not to, and she did the thing she did. She came and stood next to him. She said, "You don't have to go in there and be strong. You just can't leave her in there by herself. There's a difference." And then she took his hand and pressed something small and cold into it and closed his fingers over it. It was a brass medal, worn smooth, the kind they sell at the table in the back of a Catholic church, even though she was Baptist to the bone, a St. Christopher, the one who carries people across the water. "My husband carried this," she said. "He's across now. You keep it till you don't need it." And then she went back into the room 2 doors down, where a man with no family was dying, and sat with him. Because there was nobody else to do it. Walker went into Loretta's room. He sat down. He held her hand, and he did not leave, not that night and not the next, and he was there, holding the worn brass medal in his other fist so hard it left a mark. When Loretta took the last of the new and terrible breaths, and then did not take another, at 4:11 in the morning, and the room was not empty. And that, Walker came to understand later, was the only thing the old woman had been trying to give him. Not comfort, not even the medal. Just the difference between dying in an empty room and dying in a full one, and the chance for him to be the one who made it full. He never learned her name. He looked for her. Twice he went back to Lyons Avenue to ask, but the man she sat with had passed too, and the front desk would not give out names, and the trail went cold, and life is wide and a city is large, and Walker had a grief to get through, and he got through it the way you do, badly and then less badly, and then mostly. But he never took the medal off the lanyard. 9 years, 81,000 riders a day, and Conductor Walker punched their tickets with a worn brass St. Christopher swinging against his chest, and on the bad mornings, the anniversary mornings, he would close his fist around it on the long stretch between Fenwick and Springfield, and he would say, under his breath, where the riders couldn't hear, "You keep it till you don't need it." and he had never once stopped needing it. This is what was clipped to his lanyard, going cold against his chest, on the morning he stepped off car 4 and walked toward a gray jacket standing over a bent old woman. He got to them, just as Renee straightened up, with the handle of the cart in her hand. "Mathis," Walker said. The young inspector turned. Walker knew him. Everybody on the line knew everybody. "Devon, what's going on?" "She doesn't have valid fare," Mathis said, and his voice had the brittle edge of a man who knows in his stomach he is doing something wrong and has decided to do it louder instead. "Machine took her card," she says, "but she's 2 cents short and policy is." "I know the policy," Walker said. He had read the policy. He thought the policy was the coldest thing the Halstead Authority had done in his 29 years, and he had said so once to a supervisor and been told to mind his cars. He looked at the old woman now, in the bad light, and there was something at the edge of his memory. The head wrap, the cane, the particular stillness of her, the way she had not made herself loud, even with a man making her small. But it was 9 years and bad light, and his eyes were going, and the train was coming, and he could not yet place her. Only that something in him had begun to ring like a struck glass. "I'll cover her fare," Walker said. He was already reaching for his own wallet. "Right here, both of you watch me do it. It's covered. She's a paying rider. Write it up however you want." And Renee Carter, who had stood silent and straight while a frightened young man made her small, turned now toward this new voice. The voice that had said, "I'll cover her fare," the voice of a man stepping in for a stranger when he didn't have to, and something moved across her ruined face, because she had spent 9 years being the one who said, "Here, baby. The machine's like mine," and in all those 9 years no one had ever once said it back to her, and the note being said back to had become so ordinary that she had stopped noticing it was a thing that could happen. She said, the only thing she could think to say, "You don't have to do that." And Walker, with his wallet open in the cold, going to say, "It's nothing, ma'am, it's covered," stopped, because he knew the voice. "You don't have to go in there and be strong. You just can't leave her in there by herself. There's a difference." 9 years. He had heard that voice for 9 years inside his own head, on the anniversary mornings, on the worst mornings, and he had built the rest of her out of memory wrong, taller, younger, but the voice was exact. The voice had not aged a day, and the metal was cold against his chest, and Walker stood on the Fenwick Street platform at 6:08 in the morning, with his wallet open in his hand, and could not move. It was the second frozen moment, and it lasted, the footage would show, 9 seconds, 1 for each year. Then Walker did something that a conductor of 29 years does not do, that a grown man in front of a colleague does not do. He reached up with a shaking hand and unclipped the worn brass metal from his lanyard, and he stepped close to the old woman, and he took her hand, the way you take the hand of someone you have been looking for a long time, and he pressed the metal into her palm and closed her fingers over it. Renee Carter went still. Her whole life had been hands. For 6 years her hands had been her eyes. She knew the weight of every coin by feel, the difference between a biscuit that needed another minute and one that was done, the particular give of an old man's shoulder that meant he was crying and didn't want you to know. And now there was a small worn weight of brass in her closed palm, and her thumb moved over it the way a thumb moves, finding the shapes, the smooth, nearly gun figure of a man with a child on his back crossing water, the same metal she had carried for 31 years, and given away one Tuesday evening on Lyons Avenue to a big man crying in a hallway because she'd had nothing else to give him. And you do not leave a person alone with that. She had given away 1,000 things in her life, and never expected one of them back. "You keep it till you don't need it," Walker said. His voice broke clean in half on the word need. "That's what you told me. I want you to know. I never once stopped needing it. 9 years. Down the platform, the train was pulling in, the long gray smear of it, brakes, hissing, and a little girl, maybe 6 in a pink coat, who had been standing with her mother 3 feet away watching the whole thing the way children watch the things. Adults think they don't understand, tugged her mother's sleeve and said, in the clear, carrying voice of a child saying the simplest true thing in the world, "Mama, that lady gave him something a long time ago, and he kept it and now he's giving it back." "Is that how it works?" Her mother said, "Hush, baby." But she said it soft, because she was crying, and so was Officer Devin Mathis, 29 years old, who had keyed a citation into a handheld 11 minutes ago, and now stood holding it in a hand he could not feel, watching a thing he did not have a rule for. Renee Carter held the medal in both hands now, against her chest, over the gray $3 coat. "The man," she said finally, slowly. "The man 2 doors down. He liked the Psalms. The 139th I held his hand too. He went a week after your wife. I didn't know whose hallway I was in, baby. I just heard somebody crying who needed not to be by himself. And Walker, 29 years a conductor, who had not let himself fully cry at his own wife's funeral because he was busy organizing the cars to get the family there, put his face in his hands on the Fenwick Street platform, and for the first time in 9 years he cried, and it was not the way grief sounds in the movies. All music and one beautiful tear. It was the other way. It was the way grief sounds in a kitchen at midnight, ugly and useful. The way it sounds when a wire that has been growing into a tree for 9 years finally snaps, and the tree feels, for the first time, where the wood actually is. Mercy doesn't run trains. The chairman of the Halstead Regional Transit Authority had said in a board meeting 18 months before, and 72 hours from this morning he was going to find out he was wrong, because Mercy had been running this train, Car 4, the 611, for 9 years, in a gray $3 coat, paying 2,000 fares for strangers, and the only reason nobody knew was that Mercy, real Mercy, the kind Renee Carter's grandmother, snapped beans into her apron and tried to teach her, does not announce itself, and so it stays invisible, and so it can be put off a platform on a cold Tuesday by a frightened young man with a rulebook, and the system never even feels the thing it lost. The 611 left Fenwick Street that morning at 6:14, 3 minutes late, with Renee Carter in the third seat of car 4, left side, where the heater worked, and her cart and her box and her foil pans stowed in the vestibule. And the men at Mount Calvary got their cornbread and their corner pieces. Only 9 minutes later than usual, and Walker rode the whole line with red eyes and finished his shift, and Officer Devin Mathis sat in the Halstead break room at the end of the platform and did not eat his lunch. Here is what happened next, because the thing about a system is that it is very good at not feeling what it lost. But a person inside the system, a frightened young person, can feel it. And sometimes that is enough. Devin Mathis could not let it go. He had a daughter who was 3, and he kept seeing over and over the old woman bending down to the cart in the cold, and he kept thinking about what his own mother would have said to him if she'd seen him do it. And his own mother had a saying too, all the mothers do, and his mother's was, "I didn't raise you to be the boot." He had thought it was about not joining a gang when he was young. He understood now it was about everything. So Devin Mathis did the thing that scared him most, which was to write it up. Not the citation, the truth. He wrote a 2-page account of what he had done on the Fenwick platform on the 3rd Tuesday of January. Every word of it, and he wrote what the conductor had done, and what the old woman had said, and he attached the platform footage, because the platform had cameras, and the cameras did not blink, and at the bottom he wrote a sentence that he was fairly sure would cost him a $22.40 an hour job he badly needed, and he sent the whole thing up the chain, all the way up, because soft numbers were how you became a former Halstead employee, and he had decided he would rather be a former Halstead employee than the boot. The chain is a long thing in a system the size of the Halstead Authority. A report from a 5-month inspector does not, as a rule, reach the chairman. But Devin Mathis had attached the footage, and the footage made its way to a deputy who had a conscience and a sense of self-preservation in roughly equal measure. and the deputy understood two things at once: that this footage could become a very bad day for the authority if it got out, and that it was already, quietly, the most powerful argument anyone had ever made against Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the chairman's own fare policy. And so the deputy did the careful thing, the covering thing, and forwarded it to Damon Whitfield himself with a single line. "Sir, you need to see this before anyone else does." Damon Whitfield watched the footage alone in his office on a Thursday afternoon 48 hours after the morning of the Eaton card. He watched an old woman in a gray coat stand still for 11 seconds while a man in his authority's jacket made her smalls. He watched her bend down to a cart full of foil pans. He read the inspector's report, the part about the basement and the cornbread, and he read the part where the conductor said 9 years. And he watched the conductor unclip something from his lanyard, and he could not, on the bad footage, see what it was. He sat for a long time. He was very good at numbers, and the numbers in front of him were ugly. 2 to 3 million a year in lost fare, a $14 million deficit, a board that wanted blood, and one old woman, 2 pennies short, 2,000 fares paid for strangers over 9 years, which his own accountants, if he asked them, would tell him came to something on the order of $2,200 of fare she had personally put into his system out of a coffee can's worth of quarters, never claimed, never thanked, while his policy put her off a platform in the cold. He thought about his mother. He thought about the coffee can on top of the refrigerator and the 11:40 bus and the front door he lay awake to hear, and the smell of other people's furniture, polish, that never quite came out of her hands on weekends, and the one good dress she kept in plastic and wore cha-cha-cha into his graduation and, finally, was buried in. He thought about the fact that his mother had died 11 years ago while he was in a budget meeting, in a hospice on the other side of the city, alone, because he had told himself he would go after the meeting, and the meeting ran 90 minutes long, and then his phone rang and it was already over. And the last thing he had ever said to her 3 days before, on a Tuesday, had been a quick "I'll come this weekend." Mama from the back of a car, and he had not come. There had not been a weekend, and he had carried that for 11 years. Get yours. Nobody is coming. And look what he had gotten. Look what had come. He did not know yet, watching the footage, that the hospice his mother died in had been on Lyons Avenue. He did not know yet that there had been a woman who came twice a week to sit with the patients who had no one, and read them the Psalms, the 139th, because a person should not have to die in a room with nobody in it. He did not know yet that this woman, this exact woman in the gray coat on his platform, had very possibly been the last person in the world to hold his mother's hand. He would not know that for 24 more hours, when he did the thing that men of systems almost never do, which is to leave the building and go find out for himself. He picked up the phone and called the deputy and said, "Find out who she is. The woman, not to cite her, I want to know her name." It took the deputy half a day, because Renee Carter was nobody, and nobody is the hardest thing in the world to find. But there was the reduced fare card, the one the machine had eaten, registered to an address on Quitman Street, and there was the church on her route, and on the Friday afternoon, the third day, Damon Whitfield, chairman of the Halstead Regional Transit Authority, a man who had not personally ridden one of his own trains in 9 years, got in the back of his car and told the driver to take him to the basement of Mount Calvary Baptist on Springfield Avenue. The Friday afternoon crowd at Mount Calvary was thin, an after-school group and a few of the regulars who had nowhere warmer to be, and Renee was wiping down the long tables when she heard the basement door open at the top of the stairs and a footstep come down that she did not know. She knew every footstep that came down those stairs. This one was new and expensive, leather soles, and it came down slow, the way a man comes downstairs into a place he has never been and is not sure he belongs. "Can I help you, baby?" Renee said, toward the new footsteps, the way she said it to everybody. There was then a man's voice, and it was not a young man's voice, and it was a voice that was used to rooms going quiet when it spoke and did not know what to do in a room that didn't. He said, "I'm looking for the woman who feeds people here. They told me her name is Renee." "That's me," she said. "We're a little past breakfast, but there's pie. First of the month I make pie. Sit down." And Damon Whitfield, who had built an empire on a coffee can and a wound, who had written, "Mercy doesn't run trains," and meant it all the way down, sat down on a folding chair at a long table in a church basement, across from an old blind woman in a gray coat, and let her cut him a slice of sweet potato pie with hands that found the plate by feel. And he could not for a moment say anything at all. He had come to do a careful thing. He had come, if he was honest, to manage a situation, to get ahead of footage that could embarrass the authority, to write a check and make a problem go away, the way money makes problems go away. And he had a number in his head, a generous number, a number that would look good if it ever came out. That was the plan he had carried down the stairs. The plan did not survive the pie. "What's your name, baby?" Renee asked him, because she asked everyone, and he said, "Damon," and she said, "Damon what?" And there are 1,000 Whitfields in the world, and no reason for the name to mean anything, except that she had sat with a woman on Lyons Avenue 11 years before who held her hand at the end and talked. The way the dying talk, in pieces, about a son named Damon who ran the trains and never came, and how she wasn't angry. She wanted Renee to know she wasn't angry. She just wished she could tell him one time that getting yours was never the thing she'd meant. She'd only meant, "Don't let them make you small." And somewhere in there, she'd gotten it twisted. And she was sorry. Would somebody tell him she was sorry? And Renee had said, "I'll tell him if I ever meet him, the way you promise a dying woman anything," and had never expected to keep it, the way you never expect to keep those promises. "Whitfield," the man said. Damon Whitfield. The basement of Mount Calvary Baptist went very quiet. Renee Carter set down the pie server. Her ruined eyes did the wanting they could no longer do the doing of. And she said, slow, "The way you say a thing you have carried 11 years without knowing you were carrying it for him." The room at the end of the hall with the window that wouldn't close all the way. So she was always cold, and I brought her my own blanket, the blue one. She liked the 139th Psalm. "Whither shall I go from thy spirit?" She held my hand the last night, and she had a message, and I told her I'd carry it if I ever met you, and I have carried it 11 years, and I never thought I'd get to put it down. This is the part where the chairman of the Halstead Regional Transit Authority, 58 years old, a man of systems, a man who knew the cost per rider down to the cent, put his face in his hands at a long table in a church basement. "She wanted you to know she wasn't angry," Renee said. Soft, the way she'd said everything for 9 years. She said getting yours was never what she meant. She only ever meant, "Don't let them make you small." She said somewhere it got twisted. She said she was sorry. She wanted you to have that. She didn't want to leave you with the wrong one. Damon Whitfield wept at the table, and it was not the careful, managed thing he did everything else as. It was the ugly, useful kind, the kitchen at midnight kind, and the old men at the far table looked away the way men do to give another man his privacy. And Renee Carter came around the table and stood next to him, and she did not tell him it was going to be all right, and she did not give him advice. She put her hand on his shoulder, the way she'd learned to put it, gentle, announced first so it wouldn't startle, and she stayed there, because she had spent her whole life learning that the only thing you can really give a person in the worst moment is the fact of not being alone in it. "There's a difference," her grandmother used to say. "You just have to not leave them standing there by themselves while it happens." "The blanket," Whitfield said, finally, into his hands. "You gave her your blanket. It was cold in that room, baby," Renee said. "And she was somebody's mother." That's all that ever needs to be true. What Damon Whitfield did over the following weeks, he did not do as a careful man managing a situation. He did it as a son who had been handed back his mother's last word and could not stand to do nothing with it. He did not write Renee a check. He tried to the first afternoon in the basement. He took out the checkbook and the generous number, and Renee Carter heard the pen click and said, "Put that away, baby. I don't take what I haven't earned, and there's nothing you owe me. Your mother already paid me. She let me sit with her. That's the whole wage." And Whitfield, who had spent a lifetime believing that money was the only language a system understood, sat with the checkbook open and learned, at 58, that there were people who genuinely could not be bought, not because their price was high, but because they had never put themselves up for sale. So he did something harder than writing a check, which was to change the thing he had built. He went back to the board. He brought the footage. He played it for them, all of it. The 11 seconds of an old woman standing still, the conductor and the metal, and the younger board member, who had called the policy cruel 18 months before, sat very quietly and did not say, "I told you so," which was its own kind of grace. And Damon Whitfield stood at the head of the table and repealed Section 4, Paragraph 2, the no exception line he had written himself and argued for himself. And he said, to a room full of men in better suits than the one he'd worn at 30, "I was wrong, and I'll tell you exactly how I was wrong. A system that cannot tell the difference between a person who won't pay and a person who can't isn't a strong system. It's just a cruel one that's good at math. We are going to learn the difference." They asked him about the 2 to 3 million in lost revenue. He had an answer ready, because he was still a man of numbers, and you do not stop being what you are, you only learn to point it somewhere better. He had run it. A reduced fare program for seniors and riders with disabilities, properly funded, properly outreached, cost the authority a fraction of what the inspector force cost. And the inspector force, it turned out when you actually looked at the numbers instead of the wound, recovered less than it spent. The crackdown had never even been good math. It had only ever been a wound wearing the costume of good math. He cut the inspector force to 1/10 of its size. He took the money and he built something. He called it the Cleotha Fund. It was not a foundation with his name on the wall, the way men like him usually do it. He named it for the woman who had cleaned other people's houses for 6 days a week and ridden the 11:40 home and died in a cold room on Lyons Avenue with a stranger's blue blanket over her and her son in a budget meeting. And the fund did one simple thing, the simplest thing, the thing Renee Carter had been doing out of a coffee can for 9 years without anybody noticing. It paid the fare. When a card ran dry, when a machine ate a card, when a rider was 2 pennies short, the fare was covered, no questions, no shame, no gray jacket. He seeded it with $2 million, almost exactly the figure the crackdown had been built to recover. And he did the math for the board on a single slide. The 40 inspectors had cost the authority $3,100,000 a year in salary and equipment, and had recovered against that $890,000 in citations, most of it never collected, a program that lost $2 million a year for the privilege of being cruel. In its first 11 months, the Cleotha Fund covered fare for 19,400 riders, at an average of $1.71 a ride, and the authority's ridership on the affected lines went up 2.3%, not down, because, as it turned out, a person who is treated like a human being at the fare machine is a person who keeps riding your trains. As for Officer Devin Mathis, who had keyed a citation into a handheld on a cold Tuesday and then done the harder thing and told the truth about it, he kept his job, which had not been the likely outcome and which surprised him more than anyone. The deputy had wanted him quietly gone, a loose end. But Whitfield read the 2-page report twice and said the man should not lose his living for being the only one honest enough to write down what the cameras already saw. They moved him off the platforms. When the Cleotha Fund stood up that spring and needed someone to run the small office that processed the covered fares, someone who understood the platforms from the ground and would not look down on the people who came through the door, Damon Whitfield remembered the sentence at the bottom of the report, the one about the boot. And he gave the job to Devin Mathis. $26 an hour now, the same benefits. A photograph of a 3-year-old in a pink dress on the desk, and a private rule written in no policy book anywhere that nobody who came to his window would leave it made smaller than they came to it. And there is one more thing Damon Whitfield did, and it is the thing that closed the circle. And Renee Carter did not find out about it for 2 more months. Because nobody told her, because she was nobody, is the easiest person in the world to surprise. The Halstead Authority was, that spring, retiring 4 of its oldest commuter cars and bringing in new ones, and on the side of every new car, where the line's name went, there had always been just the route designation, a number, a letter. On the new cars on the Fenwick line, under the route designations, in small letters, there was now a name. It was not Whitfield. It was the name of a woman who had died cold in a room on Lyons Avenue, and underneath the name there was a line, 6 words, that the chairman had chosen himself out of a psalm an old blind woman had told him his mother loved. The first time the new car came through Fenwick Street, Walker was the conductor on it, because Whitfield had asked, quietly, that he be. And Renee Carter was in her usual 3rd seat, left side, where the heater worked, with a worn brass medal in the inside pocket of her gray coat next to a fresh roll of quarters. And Walker leaned down and read it to her, because she could not see it. And his voice was steady this time. 9 years of need finally setting down. It says Cleotha, he told her, and then it says, where can I go from your spirit? Renee Carter rode the train she had ridden for 9 years, the 611. And she did not say anything for a moment, and then she reached into the inside pocket of the gray coat and took out the brass medal and pressed it into Walker's hand and closed his fingers over it, the way she had 9 years before in a hallway on Lyons Avenue. You keep it now, baby, she said. I don't need it anymore. I know where she is. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? There's no room she's in by herself now. You give it to the next somebody crying in a hallway. That's how it works. That little girl had it right. That's exactly how it works. She still rides the 611. She still cooks the breakfast in the basement of Mount Calvary on Mondays and Tuesdays, and the church still buys the eggs and the grits, and she still carries the rest in herself, and she still keeps a roll of quarters in the inside pocket of the gray coat, even though the Cleotha Fund covers the fares now. Because, she says, a fund covers the fare, but it can't come stand next to you, and somebody, sometimes, still needs the standing next to more than the $10. The men still get the corner pieces of the cornbread. If you have ever been the person who stood next to a stranger when there was nothing in it for you, no one watching, no one keeping count, this story was always about you, and you should know that the count is being kept somewhere, just not where you can see it, and it comes back. It always comes back, even when it takes 9 years, even when you've stopped needing it to. Here is the question, and there is no clean answer to it, which is why it's worth asking. Renee Carter spent 9 years giving away everything she had to strangers who would never know her name, and she ended up 2 pennies short of her own city on a cold morning with nobody there to catch her, until one man happened to be looking. If Walker had been in another car the morning, if the footage had never reached the right desk, she'd have walked the 6/10 of a mile home alone and figured it out alone, the way she always had. So is a goodness that depends on being lucky enough to be seen really being rewarded. Or did she already have her whole reward, every single morning, in the standing next to itself, and the trains and the medals and the name on the car are just the world finally noticing what was already complete? Which is it? Tell me what you think, because I have gone back and forth on it for a long time, and I am not sure I have it right. There's a line in this one I keep coming back to. I'm still not sure I have it right. It's the thing Renee's grandmother used to tell her, snapping beans on a porch down in South Carolina. She said, "You don't have to fix what's wrong with a person's whole life. You just have to not leave them standing there by themselves while it happens." I think about the second half a lot. The first half is the part I want to be true. The second half is the part that costs you something. Here's what I mean. I'm at the age where I want to fix everybody, pay the rent, solve the thing. And most of the time I can't. What I can do is not leave. That's smaller. It's also the only part that was ever in my hands. If you're up past midnight tonight, sitting in a room that's a little too cold with someone whose breathing keeps changing, I wrote this one for you. You're not fixing it either. You're just not leaving. That counts. It counts more than the part you can't reach. I'll be back next week with another story about someone the world keeps walking past. You just have to not leave them standing there by themselves.